Doris and the worship team. I should have remembered I need to bring my dark glasses when I get up here, but never mind, but I can vaguely see you. I must confess to being a little bit intimidated this morning. We have present, as you probably know, Professor Ray Ronefeld, the president of Avondale College of Higher Education, who previous to that was head of the theology department. And I tell you, if I'd known he was going to be here, I wouldn't be up here this morning. And I blame Dr. Chapman for this. He should have notified me in advance that you're going to be here, Ray. So I'm sorry, Ray, but coming from an area where we have such good preachers, you've got to listen to me this morning. I just pray that God will be with us this morning now as we study his word together, that we each one might be uplifted and strengthened as we face the challenges of life. I've been known to actually have the odd game of golf. I don't think we're working, are we? Oh, yes, we are. That's just in case you don't know what a golfer looks like. I have to assure you that's not me, by the way. But just recently I had a game of golf with two of our church members, John Garland and Greg Dobbich. I happened to mention this to in front of one of our church members, and they said, "I didn't know you played golf, Warren." Well, I have to really qualify this. I'm not like that, really. And it doesn't look much like me, does it, really? For me, golf is a nice bushwalk. I spend quite a lot of time looking for the ball, and that's more typical. And sometimes my friends will help me look for the ball. But so often I'm going down one way of the fairway and they're going down the other side of the fairway. They're on the fairway, or on the other side, and I'm in the bush. So why am I rabbiting on about golf this morning? Well, what happened was that as we're coming off from this game of golf, we only played 9 holes, and we're walking along, a voice said, "Do you know where you are?" Now, young people, I understand you all have a sheet like this. So I might just happen to be mentioning this little phrase, "Do you know where you are?" a few times this morning, so you can score how many I mention that. And I might even be mentioning some other words like Jesus and heaven, so you can keep a track of those too. Now, I thought to myself when this voice said, "Do you know where you are?" I thought, what a dumb question. And before answering to find out, I thought I'd look up and find out who was making such inane comments. And when I looked up, it was one of the course officials. And what he was doing was organising a group of golfers into a competition. And he was asking one of the guys, "Do you know where you are?" And as we walked on, Greg said to me, "That'd make a good church service, wouldn't it?" And I had to agree with him. Now, I didn't discuss it with Greg, so I don't know what he had in mind. So don't blame him for what you're going to get this morning. But this is the title of my sermon this morning. Do you know where you are? Now, if I could take the time this morning and canvass a few suggestions, you'd all probably come up with something slightly different as to where you are. I suspect, and rather than take the time to ask you each one, I'm going to preempt what I think some of you would say, okay? I would suspect someone would say, "I'm in North Perth Church, of course. How dumb are you?" Someone might say, "In church." And church simply means, and I understand it's from Greek, Ray, the derivation is the Lord's house. I know some people might even say they're in the sanctuary, and that comes from a Latin word which basically means holy, so I understand if you can go by what the internet and the other sources say. Now, of course, the early Christians, they didn't have the luxury of meeting in a place like we have, so they met in various places. Later on, of course, as the church developed, they got more financial. They wanted to build edifices that were more representative of worshipping God. And as you travel around the world, you can see many examples of these. And here's just a few examples. I think one of those is Milan Cathedral, if I remember correctly. Now, the Israelites, when they left Egypt, God instructed them to make a dwelling place for him. And we know the tabernacle was established. And that's just an artist's impression of the description we've given in the Bible. We do know that they put a lot of money into it. Remember, they melted down their gold. So they lavished a lot of what they had onto this because they wanted to be representative for God. Then later on, when they got to the Promised Land, various kings vied for the opportunity to replace this portable tabernacle with a permanent temple which would be indicative of their God. And here's an artist's impression of Solomon's temple. And of course we know that was destroyed, and later on another one was built, and another one by Herod, and these in their own right were very fine buildings. Now you remember that when Jesus came to this earth and he was talking to the woman at the well of Samaria, she perceived that he was a teacher, and she said, "Good teacher, tell me, where should we worship? Should we worship in the mountain where our forefathers worshipped? Or do we have to worship down in Jerusalem where the Jews worship?" And I want you to think this morning about what Jesus said in reply to this. He said, "The time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Yet a time is coming and has come when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks." And you remember that God presided there in the tabernacle and in the temple. But this actually came to take place at the crucifixion. Because at the crucifixion, you'll remember, we're told that the veil between the holy and the most holy place was rent asunder from top to bottom, not a human hand. And the glory of God departed. It was no longer where God's presence was in that temple. So where does God dwell today? We're told very clearly in Matthew 18:20, "For where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there am I with them." And so, as we said a bit earlier, the early Christian church, they met in the homes of believers, or in rooms like in the upper room where Paul was preaching on one occasion. Or we see other cases where they worshipped at the riverbanks, because where anyone gathers in God's name, there is he. You remember when Moses was out there in the desert and he saw this burning bush. He went over to look at it. It wasn't being consumed, although there was all this fire. And God said to Moses, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." So what made it holy? It was God's presence. So do you know where you are today? At this very moment, you're in God's presence. And how we react as we gather here this morning is governed by how we view respect, how we perceive respect as a person. Also how society perceives your presence. Now in Jewish times, or Palestinian times, point of respect was to take off your shoes. So when God said to Moses, take off your shoes, it's not saying that we need to take off our shoes. I thought, you're going to take off your shoes there for a minute, Ray? We're not saying that God expects us to take off our shoes. So why did God tell Moses to take off his shoes? Because in Middle Eastern times, that was how you showed respect. It's still the same today. If you go into a synagogue, I understand you have to take your shoes off. If you go into a Muslim mosque, and I know this for sure because I had to do it, you take off your shoes as a sign of respect. And so we each one have to analyse how we react to God's presence here this morning, how we show respect. That's an individual question you each one have to ask. But above all, you need to be conscious that as we worship here this morning, God has said, where you are gathered in my name, there am I. When we look at into Revelation, the 24 elders are obviously very important people who sit in the presence of God. But notice what it says there. The 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay down their crowns before the throne. I think that gives us some insight into how we should behave in the presence of God. So God is present here now. When we leave here this morning, is God's presence still here? There's no one gathered in his name, so therefore God is not present here after we all leave. Where is he? We're told by Paul in 1 Corinthians 3:16, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? And further on in chapter 6 and 19, do you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you? So what kind of a temple does God want? And we have to ask that individually, not the corporate temple, but we are God's temple. We as individuals. So what does he want? Well, we certainly know plenty about what he doesn't want, because we're told very clearly, outside the city are those who have strayed away from God, and the sorcerers, and the immoral, and the murderers, and adulterers, and all who love to lie and do so. We're told again, in 1 Corinthians again, the immoral, thieves, the greedy, the drunkards, the slanderers, and the swindlers will not inherit the kingdom. So we need to remember that we are God's temple. Don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? You're not your own, you are bought with a price. Therefore, honour God with your body. So how do we honour God through our body? Quite clearly, from what we've already seen, we will not be doing those things which displease him. And they're clearly outlined in the text we've just read. What about looking after our bodies? Once again, if we come back to 1 Corinthians 3:16, don't you know that yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is sacred. And you are that temple. I'd like to ask you this morning, do you know where you are health-wise? And that's why we're offering this morning, that's why we're offering this morning this Living Well course, which I encourage you each one to take. As we read on, Paul also says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." Now we read in Exodus, a sacrifice should be without defect. I don't think that God expects us to be perfect. We don't have to wait until we're perfect to come to Him and give our lives to Him. But I do think it's reasonable that He should expect us to look after our bodies, His temple, living sacrifice, in a way which would honour Him. I think we should be good stewards. Our body, our health, is entrusted to us. It's a talent, and we should look after it. Our health is a talent. I think there's another aspect to it as well. We're in this world to serve. Isn't that what we're here for? Aren't we here to proclaim the everlasting gospel and the second coming? Shouldn't we be healthy then so that we can better serve Him? I was very sobered when I read in the book Counsel on Diet and Foods this statement: "A failure to care for the living machinery is an insult to the Creator." Further, I want to ask you, do you know where you are in world's history? You know, well, let me go back a little bit. You know, the apostles firmly believed that Christ was coming back the second time in their time. And there was an imperative to spread the gospel. We all know that He didn't come back. And of course we know that 1,000 years is a day to the Lord, and a day is 1,000 years. Then the Millerites came along and we said, the time is nearly here. And we had the great disappointment. So then the Seventh-day Adventist Church came up. And 130 years later, we're still here. I remember my grandparents. They wouldn't allow my father, they wouldn't fund him to go to university because he wouldn't have time to use that qualification before the Lord came. That's how bad they thought the world was. Little did they know. So my father, to perform the job that he did, had to do studies in later life. My father's been dead 27 years, or coming up 27 years, and Christ still hasn't come. So is the world getting worse? My grandparents thought it couldn't get any worse. I remember when I was doing first year chemistry at university, our chemistry lecturer was a very ardent evolutionist. And I still remember him saying, and I don't know how it came into the chemistry lesson, that doesn't matter. But he said, you know, we saw all this wickedness around us, but as we'll gradually evolve and we'll get rid of our animal tendencies and we'll all be living much more happily and life will be so much different. Have you seen that happen? I don't see any evolution to getting rid of our animal propensities. In fact, as I look around, it seems to me that it's getting worse. Let's look at some of the parameters then that we can look at and determine the state of the world, where we are in world's history. Let's look at marriage. Now we need to remember that Jesus, God, to show the relationship of Him to our church, He chose the marriage relationship. That is how sacred it is. It's not a very good analogy today if we start using the marriage relationship to show the relationship between God and His church, unfortunately. So what are we seeing in the marriage scene today? and these were 2012 figures, I think, from memory. Nearly 77% of people had cohabited before they got married. Nearly 27.5% of those marriages were formed by a minister. In other words, the rest were done by a celebrant. No effort to ask God's blessing on that union. The marriage rate has decreased. Well, that's not quite true. If you take it per 1,000 head of population, it hasn't. But when you then look at the growing population, the number of people getting married has decreased. Cohabitation without marriage is increasing. And 1 in 3 marriages end in divorce. Some cynics have said, and I think this might be a reflection on our current state of marriage in the Western world particularly, some cynic has said, a second marriage is a triumph of hope over experience. One encouraging thing is that divorce not involving children is decreasing. More and more people are staying together for the sake of the children and wait till they grow up before they divorce. This is illustrated by the story of a 90-year-old couple who got divorced. And someone said, "Why did you wait so long to get divorced?" And the man said, "We wanted to wait till the children had died." By the way, that doesn't tell you how happy those marriages are that stay together for the sake of the children. But look at this. 2012 figures, 70% of marriages, one or more of the partners have had an extramarital affair. We now have another phenomenon. It's called internet affairs, dating on the internet. Well, that's harmless, isn't it? Because they don't get together, they can't do anything wrong, can they? But you know, when Christ came, when Jesus came to this earth, he set a new dimension to our standards. Not what is observed to happen, but what is in your heart. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully, or on the internet, has already committed adultery with her or him in his heart. That is God's standard. That's his measuring stick. Another very worrying area in our world today is drugs. You know, we tend to think Australia is getting bad, but it's nowhere as bad as the US and many other countries. I've got news for you today. Australia has the highest proportion of recreational users of drugs in the world. We are number 1 in the use of ecstasy. We are 3rd in the use of amphetamines and 4th in the use of cocaine. Now look at these figures. Nearly 35% of Australians over 14 have used cannabis. And we tend to forget the most damaging drug in our society is alcohol. And we all know that Australians are good boozers. But look at the figures associated with alcohol use. 67% of assaults in WA were contributed to by alcohol or one of those other substances. 44% of deaths was due to interpersonal violence caused by alcohol in WA. Violence. Would it be fair to say that we're living in a violent society? 1 in 6 Australian women have been physically or sexually abused over the age of 15 in 2012. 1 in 6. Oh, what about men? They abuse. Do they get abused? They do. 1 in 9 men have been physically or sexually abused over the age of 15. 1 in 4 women suffer an emotional abuse. 1 in 7 men also suffer emotional abuse. And this one might surprise you. 9% of domestic violence is conducted by children. So not always safe to live with your teenage kids. And we all know that there's a currently running a Child Abuse Royal Commission. I suppose I should have put Royal in capital there, shouldn't I? And I think you've all have heard of some of the reports coming off from that commission, haven't you? If you haven't been reading the newspaper, listening to the news, or watching the news. Horrific figures. What about road rage? How many reports do you hear of road rage today? It was unknown when I was a young person. We'd hear about reports in America, but here, it's very much here in our society today, road rage. You do something wrong, get your window smashed in. I read one case the other day. The lady must have done something, she wasn't aware of it, but this person was all very angry. They stopped at the lights. She came over, punched her in the face, took her keys out and got back in her car. The poor lady was left stranded there at the lights with a black eye. Road rage. But of course we don't see any violence in sport, do we? It's amazing what they allow them to get away with and justify for violence in sports. I mentioned earlier about society standards when I was talking about what standards people have for showing respect. What's happening to our standards in our society today? Well, swearing is rampant. You know, I was brought up, not that I did ever do it, but I was told you never swore in front of women or in public. You do it with your mates or whatever I'd hear. And you never ever use the 4-letter word. Today, swearing and 4-letter words are common on the television. They still in the papers, or sometimes they put a little gap between the first and last letter. But you don't have to be very conscious of the word being used in the public media today. And I think as Christians we have forgotten the admonition that we were given both in Matthew and in James. Do not swear. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. It's clear, isn't it? And then you turn on your television and you want to look at a program. Very few that don't have murder, sex or violence. One night this week, after the news, I picked up the TV Times to have a look and see if there might be something I could look at. And first of all, they have the movies. So I looked down the movies starting at 8:30, still almost prime time, a little bit out of prime time. And this is the first 4 movies that I looked at. I didn't select them, the first 4. I'm not going to tell you what they were, but I did read the commentary, which was enough for me. Antarctic outpost terrorised by shape-shifting alien. Brutal white-knuckle action. Hybrid monsters in this gruesome feature. Highly criticised film for eroticised game of chess. And so I thought, well, you know, I don't think I'll watch any of those. What else is there? And of course, there were plenty of other programs which would feature things like crime, sex, etc. But you know what we're seeing here is mild compared with many of the movies, and particularly mild compared to what you can get on the internet. I've had to visit a few doctor's surgeries recently. I don't think they cater for male patients somehow. But I was just browsing through the stack of magazines. I don't have to tell you what's there. All about the sexual experiences, the excesses of Hollywood and other prominent people. What's happened to this marriage and what's happened to this? What standard should we be using when we read, when we listen, when we watch something? Is there a standard that we as Christians can set as the gold standard? Writing to Philippians, Paul said, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, what? Think about such things. What else do we see in our modern society? Do you think greed is prevalent in our society today? You know, it's very difficult to get a good job done at a reasonable price. It's even difficult to get a good job done at an unreasonable price, because everyone wants to make as much money in as short a time as possible. So that's the gold standard of business today, make as much as possible. The GFC was caused by greed. Nothing else but greed. Trying to get as much money. Unfortunately, they tried the wrong people, the people who couldn't pay the mortgages back. What about exploitation? Exploitation in the third world. You see these stories, don't you? In some of the third world countries, the conditions on which sweat labour is being used to produce your designer brand clothing. The classical one was one in Bangladesh a few years ago. But we don't have to go to the third world to see exploitation. Have you seen the demonstrations in the US against McDonald's? Have you seen that on the news? Well, that's just a picture of them demonstrating there outside of McDonald's. Why? Because in this part of America, McDonald's were paying $7.25 an hour. And they said, give us $15 an hour. We're worth more than that. We can't survive on $7.25 an hour. There's plenty of exploitation, even in this country. It's estimated at the current rate by 2016, the top 1% of people will own 50% of the world's wealth. What do people do with that enormous amount of wealth? There's only so many cars and houses and boats you can own. Like Imelda Marcos, how many thousand shoes did she have? You can only wear one pair at a time. So people are amassing, they're addicted with amassing wealth, while the rest of the world starves. And you know, there's some very telling statements in the Bible about the state of society near the end of time. And this is where we are in world's history. That in the last days it is going to be very difficult to be a Christian. For people will love only themselves and their money. They'll be proud and boastful, sneering at God, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful to them, and thoroughly bad. They'll be hard-headed and never give in to others. They'll be constant liars and troublemakers and will think nothing of immorality. They'll be rough and cruel and sneer at those who try to be good. They'll betray their friends. They'll be hot-headed, puffed up with pride, and prefer good times to worshipping God. They'll go to church, yes, but they won't really believe anything they hear. Don't be taken in by these people. I've chosen to take this from the Living Bible. I know it's not a direct translation, but it just puts in more modern terminology what was being said there to Timothy. So where are we in world's history? What standard are we using? Are we using the standard of the world as our benchmark? Are we using the standard of fellow church members as our benchmark? There is only one standard, one gold standard, which we can use if we are going to prepare for heaven. And that is God's standard. And Paul, writing to the Romans, made it very clear what we as Christians should be doing. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mould, but let God remould your minds from within, so that you may prove in practice that the plan of God for you is good, meets all his demands, and moves towards the goal of true maturity, from the Phillips translation. So do you know where you are in world's history? We can't rely on other people to get us there. Other people can't carry us through to heaven. It has to be our own individual effort. And Paul was conscious of this when he wrote to Philippians again. And he said to them, now that I'm no longer there to support you and to teach you, now I'm far away, be keener than ever to work out the salvation that God has given you with a proper sense of awe and responsibility. For it is God who is at work within you, giving you the will and the power to achieve his purpose. Do you know where you are today in relation to eternity? I don't think we have a final hymn, do we? Just let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, help us each one to be conscious of where we are this morning in our own personal experience, in the state of the world, and above all, as we face eternity. May we each one work out with fear and trembling our own salvation, realizing we can't do this in our own power. We can only do it through the power of God, who wants to transform us and remould us into his likeness. He wants to get heaven into us now so that we'll enjoy heaven by and by. Grant us each one the strength and determination to keep in touch with you and to allow you to remould our lives, that we might be living epistles, known and read of all men. I pray in Jesus' name.